All right, so the euthyphro. I'm going to present a few passages that might be a little bit difficult. One of them comes at the beginning of the dialogue, and it's shortly after we discover what Euthyphro is doing and why. Euthyphro, of course, is suing his father for murder. If you go back and you look at the case, it's quite convoluted, and indeed it would be very difficult to get a clear-cut pronouncement of murder out of those circumstances. However, when Socrates asks him, he says to him at line 4b, "Good heavens, certainly Euthyphro, most men would not know how they could do this," that is, prosecute their fathers, "and be right. It is not the part of anyone to do this, but of one who is far advanced in wisdom." So, Euthyphro then agrees. So Socrates says, wow, to do this, boy, you better really have a good sense of what's right and wrong. In other words, you'd have to have a good sense of justice. And when asked, his rationale for suing his father by Socrates, Euthyphro responds in a rather kind of lengthy passage there on bottom of 19. But he does say this. This is around line 4e. "Both my father and my other relatives are angry that I am prosecuting my father for murder on behalf of a murderer when he hadn't even killed him, they say. And even if he had, the dead man does not deserve a thought since he was a killer." So by his own estimation here, Euthyphro is kind of suggesting his suit is really not based in anything legitimate. "For," this is the important part here, "for, they say, it is impious for a son to prosecute his father for murder. Both their ideas of the divine attitude to piety and impiety are wrong." Now, this is why the dialogue then becomes about piety. Because what Euthyphro is doing is he's using the concept of piety in order to justify his action against his father. So we're going to need to know what piety is, and indeed Socrates had just said, well, it would take one far advanced in wisdom to know. Now, as just a rough and ready definition for ourselves, piety means respect for the gods. Basically, that's the easiest way to define it for our purpose. Obviously, you're going to need to specify this down a lot more in this case, because if Euthyphro is using piety to justify his action, then it would seem to imply that he knows what piety is. So next, here's what Socrates says. He asks him this. "It is because I realize this that I am eager to become your pupil." Oh, sorry, I'm at 5c, line 5c, page 19. "It is because I realize this that I am eager to become your pupil, my dear friend. I know that other people, as well as this Miletus, do not even seem to notice you, whereas he sees me so sharply and clearly that he indicts me for ungodliness. So tell me now, by Zeus, what you just now maintained you clearly knew. What kind of thing do you say that godliness and ungodliness are, both as regards murder and other things? Or is the pious not the same and alike in every action, and the impious the opposite of all that is pious and like itself? And everything that is to be impious presents us with one form or appearance, insofar as it is impious." To this, Euthyphro answers, "Certainly." One would really question whether he knew what he was responding to. Now, in that passage, it is quite convoluted, and we would have to ask ourselves what Socrates is asking. Basically, he's asking him to define piety, but he's asking in a rather complex way with about 5 different ideas or 6 different ideas in there. But if we analyze it and go slowly, we'll see, I think, that we can see Socrates trying to give this guy a little mini lesson on how to make a definition. So look at this. He says, first, what kind of thing is piety? And then he says, what kind of thing do you say the godliness and the godly and ungodly are? And then he says, or is the pious not the same and alike in every action? I'm sorry. the godliness and ungodliness, both as regards murder and other things. So murder and other things. And then he says, or is the pious not the same and like in every action, and the impious the opposite of all that is pious and like itself? And so, for is the pious not the opposite of the impious? And then lastly, he asks, and everything that is to be impious presents us one form or appearance insofar as it is pious. So one form. Okay. Now, what is interesting here is it could be sort of a jumble, right? If you read that, this is the kind of passage where when you read this, it sounds, absolutely incomprehensible, and it's the kind of thing that gives philosophy a bit of a bad name. But if we slow down and understand, it actually is quite comprehensible, and that indeed gives us a good sense of what Socrates is doing. That is, if we slow down and dissect it. So first he says, what kind of thing? And when he says kind, what he means is what category of being, right? So an example would be if you were to ask, what is a tree? You couldn't not somehow mention that it is a plant on some level. It is a type of plant, right? So kind, isolating the kind is the first stage in giving a definition. Next he says, tell me what the godly and ungodly are. Now notice he switched words, right? And what he's done is he has used a synonym for piety, godly. And by using a synonym, again, if you cannot define the term, perhaps using a synonym will help to understand. Then he says to consider what piety is in terms of murder and other things. In other words, you have to use many examples of what something is, because those many examples will point up to one principle. So you can't just rest your understanding on one thing, like murder. Lastly, he says, is the pious not the opposite of the impious? So the point is, the opposites can sometimes help us to understand the original. What I mean by that is this. Suppose you don't know what love is, and you're curious as to what love is. Well, maybe if you started by explaining hate, you could work your way back to a concept of love. And then lastly, he says to give me the form or appearance. And form is the idea of what something is. And this concept of form is the idea that is really behind the category or the kind of thing that something is. Form will come up again very significantly when we get to the Republic. But in general, look at what he's done. He's given him 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different ways to try to understand piety and how to articulate a definition. So a good definition is arrived at in one or several of these ways. The next question will be, does euthyphro listen? Well, let's see.